Hey guys, tonight we wander into the dim and echoing corridors of the Ottoman court, a place where cloth speaks louder than words and a single tassel on your robe might mean the difference between life, death, or just a very awkward tea invitation. You slip through the carved wooden doors of Topkapi Palace, where the air smells faintly of rosewater and roasted lamb, and where every shimmer of silk is a coded message in a language you're only just beginning to decode. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not because the Ottomans are dangerous, though to be fair they can be, but because if you tried to wear one of their full ceremonial outfits on a modern summer day, you'd collapse from heat stroke before you even found the coffee table. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing who's drifting off across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step carefully across the polished stone floors, eyes drawn not to the gilded arches or the tiled fountains, but to the people gliding past. Robes everywhere. Some trail like flowing rivers, others rustle like dry leaves in autumn. They're not just clothes, they're social armor, each fold and color layered with meaning. In this world, you don't announce who you are, you wear it. One mainstream historical fact to start us off: the Ottoman court was one of the most elaborate in Eurasia, especially by the 16th century, and its fashion reflected an empire that stretched from Hungary to the deserts of Arabia. Fabrics poured in from Persia, India, and even Ming China. Wealth was measured in yards of silk and embroidery threads dipped in gold. If you wanted to impress, you didn't buy a sports car. You commissioned a kaftan lined with sable fur and studded with tiny pearls. But here's the quirky bit you weren't expecting. Some of these garments were so stiff with brocade and jewels that people couldn't actually move in them. Historians still argue whether certain parade robes were truly worn or simply carried on poles like banners. Imagine having a closet full of outfits you can't even walk in, a kind of medieval Ottoman version of "these shoes are for sitting only." As you follow the swish of heavy robes deeper into the palace, you notice how quiet everything is. The Ottomans perfected the art of slow elegance. Servants drift past with trays of sherbet, their sleeves dangling dramatically. Eunuchs, tall in their black coats, shuffle silently. And there you are, the outsider, your plain modern shirt practically screaming tourist compared to their elaborate silks. A guard in a tall white turban glares at you, but relax, you're invisible here, just floating along like a drowsy ghost. Still, you can't help but imagine what would happen if you tried to copy their look. Picture yourself striding down your local grocery aisle in layered kaftans, a jeweled belt buckle the size of a frisbee glinting under fluorescent lights. You'd either be instantly famous or kindly escorted outside by store security. There's also something soothing about this rhythm of fashion. Every robe, every sash, every bead is not rushed. It's deliberate. The Ottomans, unlike our age of fast fashion and overnight shipping, invested in slowness. A single garment might take weeks or months of work, and you, wandering through these halls, feel your own heartbeat slowing to match. Now, you pause at a fresco showing a procession, courtiers in robes of scarlet, emerald, sapphire. Each color tells a story, but for now you just soak in the impression that you've entered a world where fabric is power, and the court is a stage lit by torchlight, with costumes as dazzling as the empire itself. The truth is, you'll never quite decode every fold, every hue. But that's part of the charm, like a lullaby in silk. For tonight you're a silent guest, drifting among the fashions of an empire that believed beauty and authority were stitched from the same thread. And so the night begins, one robe at a time, in the Ottoman court where fashion is history, and history is the quiet background hum that lulls you deeper into rest. You drift a little farther into the palace, and now your attention settles on the robes themselves, the kaftans, the flowing coats that form the backbone of Ottoman fashion. They aren't just garments, they're hieroglyphs of power stitched in silk and velvet. Each sleeve length, each decorative border whispers a secret about the person wearing it. To the untrained eye, it's just a colorful robe. To someone inside the system, it's a whole resume unfurled down the hallway. Here's a mainstream fact that anchors this scene. The kaftan was a central garment in Ottoman fashion, particularly within the court. The sultans owned wardrobes that contained hundreds, even thousands of them. Many were preserved in the Topkapi Palace treasury, where they were carefully folded, layered with herbs to keep moths at bay, and admired like priceless works of art. Some kaftans were given as gifts of honor, an outward wearable medal for loyal service or heroic acts. Receiving one wasn't just, here's a new coat. It was a public badge of belonging to the empire's inner circle. But of course there's always something peculiar. Some of these robes were so extravagantly layered that the wearer had to be physically supported while walking, like a human cake under too much frosting. Imagine trying to maintain dignified eye contact while two assistants gently prop you up so you don't topple forward. Historians still argue whether those ultra-heavy ceremonial robes were practical attire, or simply symbolic costumes used for staged moments. Either way, they tell us that Ottoman fashion leaned toward theater, not convenience. You stand there watching a vizier shuffle past, his kaftan gleaming in pale gold. At first, you think it's one layer, then you notice another, and another. Like peeling an onion, but each layer is more expensive than the last. The cuffs are embroidered with tulip patterns, each tulip a reminder of an Ottoman obsession with this flower, a craze that at one point caused tulip bulbs to sell for the price of entire houses. You may have thought modern sneaker culture was wild. Try living in a world where men traded bulbs like baseball cards. And just when you start to get comfortable, you realize something odd. The hems of the kaftans trail dangerously close to the ground, sweeping across stone floors polished by generations of slippers. One careless step and splat. Down you go, face first into a puddle of sherbet. That's why some courtiers trained themselves to walk with impossibly tiny, deliberate steps, like aristocratic penguins waddling in slow motion. It wasn't just grace, it was survival. As you drift along, you imagine trying this back home. You, striding into a Monday meeting, kaftan sleeves swishing 3 feet past your wrists, embroidered cuffs jingling with tiny bells. Nobody would hear your PowerPoint slides over the jingling. Your co-workers wouldn't ask about quarterly profits. They'd whisper, "Why does Gary look like he's about to announce the arrival of a caravan from Samarkand?" And yet, the kaftan held deep symbolism. It was protection too. Many were lined with furs from distant Siberia, or layered with quilting to shield against both cold and occasionally hidden daggers. Some robes included interior pockets so large you could practically smuggle a roast chicken. Now remember that first palace hall you wandered through? The shimmering robes, the stiff silks, they were not just art for art's sake. They were part of a ranking system so rigid that even the angle of a robe's collar could mark status. Step out of line with the wrong hem length, and you weren't just unfashionable, you were breaking protocol. Historians still debate how strictly these rules were enforced. Were they quietly flexible? Or would a scribe get a stern talking to if his kaftan cuff was an inch too wide? In this court, your robe wasn't a choice. It was your social passport. And as you let your eyes wander down those corridors of cloth, you realize that in the Ottoman Empire, people didn't just wear fashion, they carried entire hierarchies on their backs, one stitch at a time. The rustle of silk fades into a background hum, like the whisper of wind over leaves. You let it lull you further, as the kaftans of rank blur into a gentle dream, heavy with gold, yet somehow as light as sleep itself. You turn your head and realize the palace is not only alive with robes, but crowned with something even stranger. Turbans that seem to defy gravity. They rise from heads like coiled towers of silk, each twist and fold deliberate, each knot a clue to the puzzle of rank and identity. Here's a grounding fact to start. Turbans in the Ottoman Empire weren't random accessories. They were essential markers of profession, class, and sometimes even mood. A judge's turban was different from a merchant's, which was different again from a janissary's. Each variation had its own name, and the trained eye could spot status. At 20 paces, no introductions required. But the peculiar side of it. Some turbans reached sizes that would put a stack of modern throw pillows to shame. Silk wrapped upon silk, layer after layer, until the wearer's head looked like a soft-serve ice cream cone, balancing precariously in the Istanbul sun. Historians still argue whether the truly massive ceremonial turbans were practical headwear, or mostly symbolic statements, used briefly before being set aside for lighter versions. Imagine standing through a 3-hour ceremony with what is essentially a sofa cushion on your skull. You pause to watch a clerk adjusting his wrap, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Around you, a gallery of styles parades by. Turbans, in snowy white cotton, others tinted faintly with dyes, some capped with small jeweled brooches. To your sleepy eyes, they start to resemble an odd field of blooming flowers, each turban a different bud, bobbing gently as the wearer moves, and then comes the joke waiting to happen. In a world where size equaled status, you can't help but imagine the quiet competition. One man squints across the courtyard. Ah, yes, his turban is impressive, but mine blocks out the sun for 3 courtyards. It's like the aristocratic version of oversized headphones. Why settle for subtle when you can broadcast your importance in cotton layers? Of course, turbans also carried religious resonance. Wrapping cloth around the head was both a practical shield against the sun and a sign of dignity. But practical concerns had limits. You see a janissary's tall headgear, half turban, half stiff cap, tilting precariously as he leans to scratch his ear. It squeaks against his armor, and you swear you hear him mutter under his breath, something along the lines of, "Why didn't we just stick with helmets?" And yes, turbans needed upkeep. The silk wrappings had to be rewound regularly to stay crisp. A careless wrap could signal sloppiness, and nobody wanted to be the courtier whispered about for a drooping turban. Imagine the equivalent of bedhead, except it's silk head architecture collapsing over your eyes. Now there's debate among scholars about the most extreme styles. Some paintings show turban wrapping so tall and layered, they seem implausible. Were these exaggerations by European visitors trying to exoticize the Ottomans? Or were some courtiers genuinely wandering around looking like balancing acts from a circus troupe? Historians still argue over whether the tallest depictions were metaphorical symbols of dignity or accurate fashion records. You glide onward, eyes half closed, lulled by the slow rhythm of fabric folds. The rustling sounds are gentle, like sails flapping on a calm sea. For the Ottomans, turbans were sails indeed, announcing direction, catching glances, steering conversations before a single word was spoken. And as you drift, you find yourself imagining your own turban. Maybe not a grand one, perhaps something small, snug, just enough to keep your head warm on a chilly morning. You'd wrap it carefully, maybe crooked at first, then try again until it feels right. And you'd smile, knowing that even in this quiet game of cloth and status, you've joined a centuries-old conversation. The palace hums, the turbans sway, and you sink deeper into the soft, silken folds of their history. You shuffle a little further into the palace courtyard, and suddenly the turbans, kaftans, and jeweled accessories begin to point you toward one simple truth. In this empire, fashion flowed downward from the very top. If the sultan sneezed in emerald silk one morning, expect half the court to be wearing some shade of green by the next week. Here's the mainstream fact. Sultans acted as trendsetters. Their wardrobes weren't just private indulgences, they were political statements, visible symbols of authority. Many kaftans and ceremonial coats owned by sultans were preserved in Topkapi Palace, stacked and catalogued like sacred relics. The patterns, colors, and fabrics chosen by a ruler could set off waves of imitation throughout the capital. Entire. Dye guilds might scramble to keep up with a sudden demand for crimson or indigo if the sultan appeared in public wearing it. Now for something quirky. Some sultans were so particular about sleeves that entire tailors' guilds had to adjust their output. Long draping sleeves meant authority, but extra long sleeves, dragging along the floor like a royal mop, were said to mark the truly powerful. Historians still argue whether these sleeve-length trends were practical for daily wear or more of a ceremonial flourish. Because let's face it, try eating soup with sleeves the size of pillowcases, and suddenly you're wearing dinner instead of consuming it. You watch in your mind's eye as Suleiman the Magnificent strolls into the divan chamber, his kaftan, shimmering with threads of gold. Every pasha present discreetly squints, mentally taking notes. The next day, tailors all over Istanbul receive vague instructions. Something with, that shine. But not too shiny. Well, actually, maybe shinier. It's like the ancient Ottoman version of celebrity fashion influence, except instead of Instagram posts, you had real-life appearances during festivals, military campaigns, or religious ceremonies. The ripple effect was immediate. Merchants along the bazaars would adjust their displays overnight, knowing that buyers would soon be asking for the fabric His Majesty wore on Tuesday. And here's your gentle laugh of the evening. Imagine if your boss's casual Friday outfit dictated the nation's fashion. Your manager shows up in plaid socks, and by Monday there's a run on plaid so severe the entire country looks like a misplaced lumberjack convention. That was the Ottoman court in motion, except swap plaid socks for brocaded kaftans worth more than your house. But not every fashion whim was admired. Some sultans leaned toward excess, One particular robe belonging to Sultan Ahmed I was made, entirely of crimson velvet embroidered with gold, so thick it resembled a sofa more than clothing. Contemporary accounts suggest that it dazzled subjects during ceremonies, but one whispered complaint in the records hints that His Majesty seemed more like a gilded cupboard than a man. Historians still argue whether this description was satire, envy, or a literal observation of a robe too heavy for movement. You drift further into the imagery. The court assembled like a living tapestry, each official reflecting a little of the Sultan's style. The more powerful the ruler, the more carefully the courtiers mirrored him, each adjusting sleeve, turban fold, or fur trim to echo the center of the empire's fashion universe. And as you breathe slower, you notice how this trickled down beyond the palace. Street merchants in Galata, housewives in Bursa, students in madrasas, all subtly picked up traces of the Sultan's fashion. Maybe it was just a color here, or a fabric choice there. The empire was vast, but through fashion everyone was reminded of who sat at the top. For you, though, there's comfort in this thought. You don't need to keep up with the Sultan. You just float past, invisible, a gentle spectator in robes. You don't have to dry clean. The sleeves, the silks, the shining brocades all swirl around you like a dream made of fabric, and you settle into it, carried along by the slow rhythm of Ottoman fashion, dictated one sleeve at a time from the throne. You drift from the throne room into quieter galleries, and the noise of silk gives way to something subtler, the whisper of fabrics from distant lands. Every robe you pass seems to carry the scent of a caravan, the dust of a desert, or the salt of a far-off sea. The Ottoman Empire, after all, was stitched together by trade, and its wardrobes were a patchwork map of the known world. Here's a grounded fact. The Ottomans imported textiles from across Eurasia. Persian velvets, Indian cottons, Chinese silks all found their way into palace wardrobes. Bursa itself became a famous weaving hub, turning imported silk threads into locally patterned brocades prized by the court. And because Istanbul sat at the crossroads of East and West, the empire became both a consumer and producer of global fashion. The quirky side. Some garments were lined with fabric so rare they were almost mythical. There are records of kaftans lined with samite, a heavy silk from Central Asia that was already considered antique by Ottoman times. It's like someone today demanding a jacket lined in discontinued wallpaper, impractical but oh so stylish. Historians still argue whether some of the more exotic fabric references in court records were accurate or exaggerated flourishes from chroniclers eager to impress. You lean against a marble pillar and picture a merchant's caravan trudging into the capital. The camels sway, bells jingling, crates stuffed with bolts of fabric wrapped tightly against dust. At the gates, palace officials wait, not for gold or spices, but for the true treasure, cloth soft as whispers, shimmering like moonlight. On the Bosphorus. These fabrics weren't just luxuries, they were political tools. To wear Persian velvet was to hint at influence across borders, while donning Chinese silk carried the quiet weight of an empire, confident in its reach. Of course, the Ottomans also developed a taste for imitation. If a foreign cloth became too scarce, local weavers would recreate it, sometimes adding their own twist. A Chinese cloud pattern might morph into tulips or carnations to fit Ottoman tastes. Imagine today's knockoff sneakers, except instead of adibas you have Ottoman silk. inspired by but definitely not from Ming China. You watch the court tailors unroll a bolt of velvet the color of midnight. As the fabric slides over the floor, it makes a sound like a sigh. The vizier nods approvingly. Across the hall, a rival noble smirks, tugging his own coat lined with something rarer still, ermine fur from distant forests. You realize the palace isn't just a place of governance. It's a runway, and each noble is competing for the empire's most extravagant fashion statement. And then comes your moment of levity. Imagine if your local customs office had to approve shipments not of electronics or cars, but of 12 rolls of star-patterned silk, 1 crate of peacock blue velvet, and 3 bales of suspiciously shiny cotton. The poor bureaucrat would drown in fabric before ever reaching the tax ledgers. Back in your drifting narrative, the fabrics themselves start to feel alive. Each one tells a story. The rough cotton of Indian looms, softened by river water. The shimmering silk dyed in vats of indigo so deep you'd swear you could fall in. The velvet thick enough to mute footsteps on marble floors. And though you'll never touch them, you feel their textures in your imagination. A sensory lull that presses you deeper into calm. Scholars still debate how much influence foreign fashions had on everyday Ottomans outside the palace. Did a merchant's wife in Aleppo really wear a gown cut from imported Chinese silk? Or did those fabrics remain locked in treasuries, glimpsed only in fleeting ceremonies? The answers drift like the threads themselves, tangled but endlessly. Fascinating. For now you just watch the fabrics pass, shimmering like dreams unrolled across stone floors, and in that slow parade of cloth from every corner of the earth, you let yourself drift too, into a world stitched from faraway looms, where fashion was geography, and every robe carried the whisper of distant winds. You ease yourself further into the palace corridors, and the silken rustle shifts to something more martial. Ahead of you marches a line of men in uniform, not courtiers, not merchants, but the janissaries, the elite soldiers of the empire. They are dressed to intimidate, yet somehow their outfits lean halfway between military practicality and fashion experiment. Here's the grounded fact. The janissaries were the sultan's household troops, elite infantry drawn originally from the devshirme system. Their uniforms were distinctive. Long coats, belts for carrying weapons, and the famous Burke headgear, a tall white conical cap with a long flap hanging down the back. This flap was said to symbolize a sleeve of the Prophet Muhammad, tying their martial authority to spiritual legitimacy. Their outfits were as symbolic as their swords. Now for the quirky detail. The Burke caps were so tall and rigid that some observers joked they looked like stovepipes wobbling in formation. Historians still argue whether these caps were primarily functional, helping them stand out on the battlefield, or mostly ceremonial, designed to intimidate more than protect. Either way, imagine trying to run, leap, or duck arrows while balancing a floppy cotton skyscraper on your head. You linger near the barracks and notice the uniforms are not uniform in the modern sense. Some janissaries wear dark blues, others deep reds and a few sport embellishments, sashes in wild patterns, belts glittering with buckles shaped like stars. The empire allowed a measure of individuality, as long as it didn't undermine the collective image of order and loyalty. And then comes your sleepy chuckle. Picture a squad of janissaries filing into your local gym, each in those dramatic hats, trying to fit beneath the pull-up bars. One sneeze and the entire row of hats would topple like dominoes. Yet in the palace, Their very absurdity became part of the intimidation. These were men who fought wars dressed like fashion-forward scarecrows, and still won. The soldiers' coats, too, carried subtle flair. Heavy wool for winter, lighter cottons for summer campaigns, and fur linings for long nights on the march. In their belts they tucked curved daggers, some so beautifully decorated you wondered if they were meant for combat or just admired at banquets. Some janissaries even wore wide, flaring sleeves, which had the side effect of catching soup during meals. You suspect many a barrack story involved someone wearing dinner home by accident. As you watch them drill in the courtyard, you realize their fashion was more than appearance. It was discipline. Every piece of cloth reminded them they belonged to something greater, a brotherhood bound not only by loyalty but by uniformity. And yet the odd decorations, the oversized hats, the impractical sleeves, they suggest a softer truth. Even warriors wanted to look stylish while intimidating. Enemies. Historians still debate how much of their uniform remained unchanged over centuries. Some claim the janissaries fiercely guarded tradition, wearing nearly identical outfits across generations. Others argue their styles shifted as Ottoman tastes evolved. Were they conservative soldiers or accidental trendsetters? The answer, like the hat flaps, hangs in uncertainty. You close your eyes and hear the shuffle of boots, the faint clink of buckles, the collective hum of men dressed both for battle and for show. And you let it carry you, this paradox of fashion and war. Uniforms that frightened enemies, puzzled Europeans, and left you feeling oddly soothed by their steady, rhythmic presence. The janissaries march past, stovepipe hats swaying, sleeves rustling like sails, and in their wake silence returns, soft, heavy, and oddly comforting. You follow the echo of boots and soon slip into a quieter wing of the palace. Here the martial rhythm of janissary uniforms dissolves into something much stranger, palace accessories. If robes and turbans spoke of power, the little extras whispered of personality, luxury, and sometimes outright silliness. One grounded fact: Ottoman courtiers adored accessories. Belts studded with gems, daggers in embossed sheaths, signet rings heavy enough to bruise your knuckles, and pouches for coins or perfumes all served practical purposes but were designed to dazzle. Many items doubled as gifts of honor, like jeweled hilts given to visiting ambassadors. The accessory economy was booming, and guilds of goldsmiths, leather workers, and jewelers thrived under court patronage. Now for the peculiar detail: some palace gentlemen carried jewel-encrusted coffee stirrers. Yes, really. The empire loved its coffee, and some officials, unwilling to be seen with a plain wooden spoon, commissioned golden stirrers inlaid with pearls. Historians still argue whether these were actually used for mixing or simply displayed as status symbols. Because let's be honest, if you're stirring your latte with a ruby-tipped rod, you're not subtle about it. You notice other oddities too. Perfumed satchels dangled from belts, filled with cloves, ambergris, or dried rose petals, releasing a faint aroma with every step. One vizier passes by, trailing the smell of musk so strong you wonder if his colleagues ever staged an intervention. Yes, Ahmed, we smell you. The entire courtyard smells you. Still, in a world before deodorant aisles, a perfumed pouch was both practical and fashionable. Then there were the belt buckles. Not the discreet kind that just keep your trousers up. No, these gleamed like dinner plates. Some were enameled with floral designs, others sculpted into animal shapes. A few even had tiny hinged compartments for coins or miniature Qurans. Imagine today's fanny packs, but designed by Cartier, and you're close. You pause at a display case where an official's dagger rests. The blade is curved, sharp, deadly. But the sheath? It's crusted in turquoise, emerald and ivory. You think to yourself, was this meant for defense or just to blind the attacker with sparkle? Here's a gentle laugh to carry you further. Picture walking into your local cafe, reaching into your bag and pulling out a diamond-studded stirrer for your cappuccino. People would assume you'd either won the lottery or lost your mind. But in the Ottoman palace, such flourishes were part of the everyday performance. And yet, beneath the glitter there was function. Rings carried seals for signing documents, knives doubled as eating tools. Satchels kept herbs close to mask the less-than-rosy smells of crowded courtyards. Even the ridiculous had a purpose. Historians still debate how widely these accessories were used by commoners. Were jeweled coffee spoons ever seen in the streets of Bursa, or were they strictly palace toys? Did the perfumed satchels trickle down to middle-class merchants, or remain exclusive to viziers and pashas? The record is hazy, but the imagination is sweet. You lean back, lulled by the vision of glittering buckles and scented satchels. The accessories clink, sway, and rustle softly, a delicate counterpoint to the heavy robes and towering turbans. And as they fade into the hum of palace life, you feel yourself sinking deeper into that sleepy space, where every shiny trinket becomes a twinkling star in the dark. You let the sparkle of jeweled stirrers fade behind you, and soon you find yourself in a quieter courtyard, where the fashions of men and women drift together in contrasting currents. Here, gender plays out in folds of fabric and veils of mystery, in fur collars and layers of gauze, each outfit a coded performance of role and expectation. A grounded fact, Ottoman women of the elite wore long, flowing entaris, gowns that could be layered with jackets or coats, often made of gauzy silks, or finely woven cottons. In public, women covered themselves with veils, yashmaks, and outer cloaks, farases, ensuring a balance between modesty and display. Men, by contrast, often layered fur-trimmed kaftans, their status shown in the depth of the fur, sable being the height of prestige. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some women's shoes, hidden under cloaks, had soles elevated several inches off the ground, not unlike proto-platform heels. These clogs, called nalins, clattered against marble floors, announcing arrivals before a word was spoken. Imagine a silent courtyard suddenly filled with the clip-clop of wooden stilts, fashion as a sound effect. Historians still argue whether these shoes were everyday wear or mostly for bathhouses, where wooden soles kept delicate feet away from hot, wet tiles. You picture a procession, men sweltering under fur collars in midsummer heat, refusing to admit discomfort because dignity required silence. Women gliding by with veils that shimmer faintly in the light, concealing expressions, but revealing just enough to tantalize the imagination. Each step feels rehearsed, a ballet of fabric, where who you are is told by what you do not show as much as by what you do. And here comes your smile for the evening. Imagine attending a modern office party where every man insists on wearing a full winter parka indoors to assert status, while the women arrive in cloaks, so sweeping they need 2 assistants to steer them through the buffet table. The Ottomans would have fit right in, only with more silk and the occasional whiff of rosewater. Fashion wasn't simply about gender separation, though. There were subtle crossovers. Men sometimes wore perfumes and embroidered slippers that wouldn't look out of place in a woman's wardrobe, while women occasionally adopted masculine tailoring in jackets or outerwear. Gender in Ottoman fashion wasn't rigid lines, but interlacing threads. Historians still debate the degree of flexibility here. Were these overlaps common acts of style, or daring exceptions that raised eyebrows at court? You lean back in your imagination, listening. The muffled rustle of veils blends with the quiet swish of fur-lined kaftans. The elevated shoes clatter softly, like rain on stone. It's a lullaby of contrasts, concealment and display, softness and weight, quiet dignity and noisy footwear. And as the scene fades into twilight, you realize the palace was not just a theater of power, but also of gendered fashion, where every layer of cloth negotiated identity, expectation, and desire. You drift with it slow and steady, like fabric slipping through gentle hands. You let the sound of clattering narlins drift away, and your gaze drops naturally toward the ground. Now you notice the curious parade of footwear shuffling through the courtyards. Slippers, sandals, boots, each with its own personality. Ottoman fashion wasn't just about what shimmered at eye level, it lived at your feet too. A grounded fact, Ottoman footwear included charak, leather sandals, chisme, boots, and the famous curled slippers, often called babush or Yemeni. These slip-ons, usually made of soft leather, were worn indoors and out with their upturned toes, sometimes exaggerated into little curls. In winter, fur-lined boots came into play, while wealthier Ottomans might pair jeweled slippers with richly dyed socks. Now for the quirky twist. Elevated platform shoes called kabkab or nalins weren't just for women. Men too occasionally wore raised wooden soles, sometimes so high they risked a wobble at every step. Imagine shuffling across a marble courtyard on what amounted to stylish stilts. Historians still argue whether the tallest examples, some surviving pairs are nearly half a foot high, were everyday footwear or ceremonial exaggerations. After all, nothing says I'm important quite like needing a spotter to help you balance. You crouch in your imagination to study a janissary's boots. They creak faintly, the leather oiled but stiff. Then a courtier glides by in red slippers, their curled tips bouncing with each step, like mischievous punctuation marks. The soundscape becomes its own gentle music. The squeak of leather, the clop of wooden soles, the soft slap of slippers on stone. And here comes the joke that makes you smile. Picture a room full of Ottomans removing their slippers before entering. A chamber, just a neat row of curly-toed shoes lined up by the door. One wrong step and suddenly you're playing Guess Whose Slippers, like a historical game of musical chairs. The truth was, shoes mattered. Brightly dyed slippers announced wealth, while simple leather sandals spoke of modesty or rural origins. Even the squeak of well-polished leather was a subtle boast. Hear that? That's the sound of imported cowhide. Meanwhile, the kabkab, clatter in bathhouses turned every visit into a percussion concert, where dozens of wooden soles made the hammam sound like a sleepy tap dance rehearsal. Historians still debate how much color coding played a role in footwear. Some sources suggest yellow slippers were favored by Christians, black by Muslims, red by Jews, though others argue these divisions blurred over time. What's certain is that a stroll through Istanbul meant encountering a rainbow at ankle height, a slow shuffle of hues and curls gliding across cobblestones. You breathe with the rhythm of it now. Squeak, slap, clop. Footsteps like a lullaby, grounding the glitter of turbans and kaftans in something earthy, practical, almost endearingly clumsy. And as you sink deeper, you realize even the smallest details, the curve of a slipper, the squeak of polished leather, were threads in the Ottoman fabric of fashion. The shoes pass on, curling tips vanishing into shadow, and you let the courtyard quiet itself into soft stone and stillness. You let the squeaks and clops of Ottoman slippers echo behind you, and as you drift into the next stretch of the palace, you notice something subtler, the way the air feels different depending on the season. Here, fashion isn't only about symbols and sparkle. It's about surviving Istanbul's weather, which can swing from icy winds off the Bosphorus to humid summer heat that clings like a damp blanket. A grounded fact, Ottoman wardrobes were carefully attuned to the seasons. In winter, kaftans were lined with furs, sable, ermine, fox, even lynx for the most prestigious. Summer brought gauzy cottons, airy linens, and silk robes cut lighter and looser to catch every stray breeze. Seasonal wardrobes were so essential that palace treasuries stored separate collections, rotated like clockwork with the calendar. Now for the peculiar bit, there are records of certain coats stuffed with cotton batting to such extremes they resembled walking duvets. Courtiers would shuffle through snowy courtyards looking like upright quilts. Historians still argue whether some of the most padded garments were genuinely for warmth or simply exaggerated displays of wealth, because nothing says, "I'm important," like needing two servants to help you bend your elbows in a fur-lined cocoon. You linger at the edge of a snowy garden in your imagination. A vizier trudges past, his robe so heavy with sable trim, it practically sweeps the snow for him. Behind him, a servant scurries with a small brazier to keep his master's hands warm, because gloves, oddly enough, were rare in Ottoman fashion. Meanwhile, in summer, you picture that same vizier tossing aside the furs and donning a translucent linen robe that flutters like a ghost whenever he breathes. And here's your gentle laugh of the evening. Imagine if your office required everyone to switch uniforms with the seasons. In January, mandatory puffer coats with fur collars. In July, sheer silk shirts that flutter every time the AC kicks on. Fashion as a corporate weather report. The Ottomans weren't only thinking of themselves. Seasonal garments were also political gifts. A winter robe lined in sable might be presented to a loyal official, while summer silks were distributed during festivals. These weren't mere tokens. They were survival aids wrapped in prestige. To refuse such a gift would be both ungrateful and foolish. You pause to note how fabrics themselves adapted. Wool was imported from Anatolian highlands for cold weather. Coats, while lighter Indian muslins and Syrian cottons were prized for summer robes. Seasonal wardrobes thus reflected not only the climate, but the empire's geography, each garment a little map of Ottoman diversity. Historians still debate the extent to which common people mirrored this seasonal rotation. Did villagers in Anatolia really shift wardrobes so dramatically, or was this a luxury confined to the palace and upper classes? Sources suggest that while elites rotated fabrics, everyday folk simply layered what they owned, adding cloaks in winter and shedding them in summer. For you, though, the imagery is enough. Heavy furs rustling in the snow, sheer cottons sighing in the heat. Fashion tuned to weather, fashion as survival, fashion as rhythm. It slows you down, reminds you of the gentle passage of seasons, one robe giving way to another, one layer peeled back as time drifts on, and in that cycle you sink deeper, swaddled in sable one moment, airy linen the next, letting the Ottoman seasons lull you like a cradle rocking from winter to summer, back again. You wander on, past the fur-lined coats and gauzy summer silks, and now you find yourself in a quieter chamber, where laughter rings out, softer and higher pitched. This is the world of Ottoman children, dressed like little reflections of their elders, tiny kaftans and miniature turbans bobbing as they run between the tiled columns. A grounded fact: elite children in the Ottoman Empire were often dressed in scaled-down versions of adult fashion. Boys wore small turbans, little coats, and sometimes even fur-trimmed garments, while girls were wrapped in bright silks and veils suited to their family's station. Clothing trained them early in the codes of rank, teaching them how to move, how to wear dignity as comfortably as cloth. Now for the peculiar side. Some ceremonial outfits for children were so elaborate that the poor kids could barely walk in them. During grand circumcision festivals, massive multi-day celebrations sponsored by the sultans, boys were dressed in embroidered jackets, satin trousers, and little capes, sometimes topped with plumed headpieces. Historians still argue whether these outfits were practical or purely theatrical, since paintings show boys paraded on horseback, looking equal parts regal and uncomfortable. Imagine being 7 years old, trying to smile through a hat that weighs as much as your school backpack. You watch one child shuffle by, his kaftan sleeves too long, dragging along the tiled floor like floppy wings. Behind him, a nursemaid scoops up the fabric before it gathers too much palace dust. Another little one toddles past in slippers, so shiny you can see your reflection in them, his turban wrapped carefully yet comically oversized. He looks like a lollipop balanced on a stick. Here's your chuckle of the evening. Imagine a kindergarten class picture, but every child is wearing fur-trimmed robes, gold-threaded belts, and jeweled slippers. Instead of smiling sweetly, they're frowning because their collars itch and their turbans tilt sideways. That's Ottoman children's fashion in a nutshell. Adorable, extravagant, and faintly ridiculous. Of course, there were practical sides, too. Everyday play clothes were simpler. Cotton shirts, small trousers, sometimes a short vest. Wealthier. Children might still have silk linings, but the colors were bright and playful. Greens, yellows, pinks, that contrasted with the darker, stately shades of adult wardrobes. Historians still debate how much autonomy children had in clothing. Were they simply dressed by parents and servants, or did older children sometimes assert preferences? Some records hint at spoiled little princes refusing to wear certain fabrics, while other sources suggest obedience was expected. The truth, as with many things, is probably somewhere in the middle. You lean back, letting the sounds of children's laughter mingle with the swish of silk. The garments may have been uncomfortable, but they were also a kind of training, teaching the next generation of Ottomans how to carry the weight of status, even if it came in the form of a tiny, itchy turban. And as the children tumble past in their miniature finery, you feel your own mind soften. The palace, once filled with intimidating viziers and glittering accessories, now hums with the gentle comedy of children in costumes too grand for their years. It's a lullaby in silk and laughter carrying you deeper into rest. You leave the laughter of children behind and find yourself slipping into a quieter hall, where the sound changes from giggles to something rhythmic. The snip of shears, the tap of hammers, the soft hiss of dye bubbling in great vats. This is the unseen side of Ottoman fashion, the tailors and guilds, the hidden hands that stitched grandeur into every robe. A grounded fact, Ottoman cities, especially Istanbul and Bursa, were full of specialized guilds that controlled every step of clothing production. There were guilds for silk weavers, dyers, embroiderers, furriers, tailors, and even button makers. Each guild followed strict rules about quality, prices, and apprenticeship. To become a master tailor could take years, with apprentices learning not only stitches, but also the complex symbolism of colors, trims, and sleeve lengths. And here's the quirky detail. Tailors were sometimes required to produce test garments for inspections, pieces of clothing that weren't meant to be worn but existed to prove skill. Historians still argue whether these trial garments were kept as teaching tools or dismantled for their materials after inspections. Imagine pouring weeks of work into a robe that would never see daylight, only to have your master say, "Very nice. Now take it apart." You stand in your imagination by a dye workshop. Large vats bubble, steam rising in fragrant clouds, saffron yellow, indigo blue, madder red. Dyers stir with long paddles, their arms stained with color that will not wash out. Each splash feels alive, a reminder that fashion was not conjured from thin air but coaxed from plants, insects, and minerals, each pigment hard-won. Nearby, embroiderers sit cross-legged, gold thread slipping through their fingers like sunlight, turned into line. They lean close, eyes straining, stitching tulips, carnations, and arabesques onto kaftans, destined for the court. A single robe might take months, even years, and when finished it glowed like a miniature garden. Here's your gentle laugh tonight. Imagine applying for a modern job by handing over a three-piece suit you made yourself. Your interviewer picks it up, squints at the stitching, and says, "Impressive. Now unpick every seam to prove you really did it." That's the energy of the Ottoman tailoring guilds. Beyond the palace, guilds also played roles in public festivals. On certain holidays, each guild paraded through Istanbul, showing off its craft with floats, banners, and sometimes even live demonstrations. Tailors might march with giant scissors painted gold, while furriers carried banners decorated with pelts. It was half parade, half advertisement, all woven into the social fabric of the city. Historians still debate how much influence guilds had over politics. Some argue they were strictly economic bodies, while others suggest they held quiet sway, able to pressure the court through strikes or demonstrations if treated unfairly. What is clear is that without them, the Ottoman palace would have been far less dazzling. You breathe in the imagined sense of dye vats, earthy madder, sharp vinegar fixatives, sweet rosewater rinses. You hear the snip of scissors, the pull of thread, the low hum of craftsmen chatting as they work late into the night. Fashion here isn't just robes and turbans, it's labor, patience, devotion. And as you float past the guild halls, you realize the true lullaby of Ottoman fashion isn't the swish of silk or the clop of shoes. It's the quiet rhythm of hands at work, stitching dreams into cloth, one patient motion at a time. You drift away from the clatter of guild parades and into a smaller, more intimate chamber of the palace. At first, you think the air is still, but then you notice it, soft, layered scents rising with every movement of fabric. Ottoman fashion wasn't just seen, it was smelled. Clothing itself became a vessel for fragrance, a walking cloud of spice, flower, and musk. Here's the grounded fact. Perfumed garments were common among the Ottoman elite. Robes could be sprinkled with rosewater, sachets of herbs sewn into hems, and belts infused with ambergris or musk. A person entering a room might announce their presence, not with words, but with a faint drift of clove or jasmine. For an empire obsessed with ceremony, scent was another silent language. Now for the quirky detail, some sources describe robes stuffed with cloves, so heavily perfumed that servants had to handle them carefully to avoid sneezing fits. Historians still argue whether these spice-stuffed garments were genuinely practical deodorizers or simply theatrical luxuries for festivals and weddings. After all, wearing a jacket that doubles as an herb rack is a bold choice, even by palace standards. You imagine the air of a banquet hall. Courtiers arrive in waves of fragrance, one trailing rose, another with sharp musk, a third carrying the sweetness of cinnamon. Together the scents mingle until the entire room smells like an exotic spice market under a silk canopy. You almost expect a vendor to pop up between the pashas, offering 3 pinches of saffron, special price for you, and here's your sleepy laugh. Imagine if modern laundry detergent commercials advertised, now with genuine clove-stuffed sleeves, guaranteed to make your co-workers hungry. The Ottomans beat them to the idea centuries ago. Perfume wasn't just about impressing company. It also served practical ends. In a crowded palace of thousands, smells could quickly turn less than regal. Sachets of dried flowers, tucked discreetly into collars or cuffs, acted as medieval deodorant. One court record even mentions officials keeping scented handkerchiefs constantly at the ready to press against their noses in particularly ripe environments. Fragrance was political too. The sultan might bestow rosewater-scented robes upon honored guests, the aroma itself a memory they carried back to their homeland. Traders wrote of being overwhelmed by the sweet smells of the Ottoman court, describing it as a place where even the air was gilded. Historians still debate how far down the social ladder perfumed clothing traveled. Did middle-class merchants in Aleppo walk around smelling faintly of amber and musk? Or was this luxury confined to the palace elite? Surviving garments suggest sachets were sewn mostly into courtly robes, but folk songs hint at perfumed scarves among commoners too. You close your eyes and breathe in the imagined mix: clove sharpness, rosewater sweetness, smoky musk. It clings not only to robes but to memories. Fashion here is not just a visual show, it is olfactory theatre, a slow, invisible lull that settles over everyone in the room. And as the fragrances swirl around you like unseen silk, you drift deeper, soothed by the thought of clothes that whisper through scent as well as sight, garments that carry gardens and spice markets wherever their wearers go. You drift further through the palace, where the air thick with perfume slowly gives way to something sterner, the whisper of rules. It turns out not everyone in the empire could wear whatever they liked. Fashion here was not only about taste, it was also about law, a grounded fact. The Ottomans enforced sumptuary laws, rules that dictated which classes could wear which fabrics, colors, and styles. Certain silks, jewel tones, or furs were reserved for elites. Merchants, artisans, and peasants were expected to stay within more modest bounds, not daring to upstage the vizier or, heaven forbid, the sultan himself. Laws of luxury were written into the very seams of society. Now for the peculiar tidbit, some decrees went so far as to regulate shoe colors. In certain eras, yellow shoes were permitted for Christians, black for Muslims, and red for Jews. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were consistently enforced or mostly theoretical. Surviving accounts suggest some people wore whatever they pleased until caught, then offered a sheepish bribe to the local magistrate. Imagine a fashion police officer chasing someone down the street yelling, "Excuse me, sir, those crimson slippers are above your station." You picture the scene vividly. A wealthy silk merchant, flush with profit, secretly commissions a robe, dyed in imperial crimson. He wears it proudly to a festival, only to draw suspicious stares. By sundown, an official sidles up, clears his throat and mutters, "Nice kaftan. Shame if someone confiscated it." The merchant coughs up a fine. The robe disappears into a treasury chest and the lesson is learned, until the next merchant tries his luck. Here's your sleepy chuckle tonight. Imagine modern equivalents. Only CEOs allowed to wear navy suits, middle managers stuck in beige, interns restricted to lime green. Boardrooms would look like strange parades of coded peacocks. The Ottomans lived in such a rainbow of regulated wardrobes, but rules, as always, were both strict and porous. Some nobles flaunted them, daring to wear prescribed fabrics. Others used loopholes, dyeing cloth slightly off the restricted shade, claiming it wasn't quite crimson but dark pink. Historians still debate whether enforcement was harsher in the capital than in provinces, where governors may have looked the other way. These laws weren't only about hierarchy, they were also about economy. By reserving certain imports or rare dyes for elites, the court ensured demand and prices stayed high. It was as much market control as social control. Fashion became a way of balancing books as well as egos. You lean back in your drifting vision. In the hush of the palace, you hear faint murmurs of tailors whispering about forbidden dyes, merchants nervously tugging at too shiny sleeves, courtiers smirking when someone oversteps. It's all a game of appearances, regulated by decree, enforced by watchful eyes. And yet, as the whispers fade, you find comfort in the absurdity of it all. Robes as legal documents, slippers as signatures, fabrics as passports. The Ottomans wrapped power not only in silk, but in rules about silk, weaving law and luxury into one slow, soothing tapestry. You let the whispers of forbidden dyes and confiscated slippers dissolve, and soon another voice drifts in, not from the palace, but from the travelers who came to witness it. For centuries, European visitors poured into Istanbul, and they rarely kept quiet about what they saw. Their diaries, sketches, and letters painted the Ottoman world in fabrics of wonder, confusion, and sometimes outright exaggeration. A grounded fact. European envoys and travelers often described Ottoman fashions in their writings. Venetian diplomats marveled at the endless kaftans. French ambassadors compared turbans to pillars of linen, and English merchants scribbled notes about slippers, robes, and veils. These descriptions filtered back to Europe, shaping images of the empire as exotic, luxurious, and slightly overwhelming. Now for the quirky tidbit. One visitor complained that Ottoman turbans were so large they blocked his view during official ceremonies. He grumbled that he couldn't see the Sultan properly because the rows of officials looked like a wall of cotton towers. Historians still argue whether such complaints were sincere frustrations or playful exaggerations meant to amuse readers. Back home, After all, nothing spices up a travelogue like mockery of someone else's hat. You picture a French ambassador scribbling furiously, "Today I saw a robe so embroidered it glittered more than the chandelier." Then with a dramatic sigh he adds, "I was nearly blinded." His audience in Paris imagines Istanbul as one giant fashion show where courtiers shuffle like jeweled penguins. And here comes your chuckle for tonight. Imagine a travel blogger, today trying to post an Ottoman fashion review. Top 10 turbans you won't believe exist, complete with clickbait drawings. The Ottomans would have gone viral centuries before Wi-Fi. European women, too, gossiped about Ottoman veils and faraces. Some described them as mysterious and alluring, while others dismissed them as oppressive. Curiously, many European women experimented with Turkish-inspired garments, loose gowns called Turkery outfits, when they returned home. These imitations often missed the point, turning practical veils into theatrical costumes for masquerade balls. Historians still debate how accurate these European depictions were. Were they reliable accounts of genuine fashion, or heavily filtered through Orientalist stereotypes? The truth likely lies somewhere between, exaggeration wrapped around kernels of reality. You let the voices of travelers wash over you, their words drifting like incense, admiration, confusion, envy, mockery. They are half tourists, half critics, never quite understanding but always fascinated. And as they chatter in your imagination, you sink deeper, soothed by the idea that Ottoman fashion was not only clothing, but a stage show, watched, recorded, and misremembered across continents. The diaries close, the ink dries, and the murmurs fade into sleep. The chatter of European pens fades away, and now your attention drifts back to the fabrics themselves, shimmering in shades that carry meanings beyond beauty. In the Ottoman world, color wasn't just decoration. It was a language, and if you knew how to read it, you could tell a whole life story just by looking at a sleeve. A grounded fact: colors in Ottoman fashion often carried symbolic weight. Crimson was linked to wealth and authority, green was associated with Islam and piety, and blue could suggest melancholy or spiritual depth. Even within court ranks, certain hues were more than preferences. They were coded signals of office, privilege, or devotion. And then the peculiar detail: archival records mention officials quibbling over the exact shade of certain colors. One dispute describes whether a robe was true crimson or merely dark rose, with a scribe dutifully noting the argument. Historians still argue whether these squabbles reflected strict legal consequences, like violating sumptuary laws, or simply obsessive fashion debates among courtiers with too much time. Imagine men in towering turbans leaning over fabric swatches, bickering like contestants on a medieval design show. You picture the courtyard glowing with these hues, crimson robes flickering like embers at dusk, emerald turbans bright as spring, grass and deep indigos that look as though they've swallowed the Bosphorus. Each step across the stones is like a brushstroke in a painting, the palace itself transformed into a living canvas. Here's the chuckle to carry you further. Imagine attending a wedding where every guest wears color-coded outfits that announce their profession. The DJ in orange, the caterer in purple, the accountant solemnly cloaked in navy. That was the Ottoman palette, half dress code, half rainbow. Colors weren't always fixed, though. Over time, associations shifted. Some shades once reserved for elites eventually trickled down to merchants or soldiers. Others fell out of favor entirely. replaced by new dye imports or changing tastes. The symbolism was alive, evolving, sometimes contradicting itself. Historians still debate the true meaning of certain colors. Was yellow a cheerful sign of joy or a reserved shade for specific minorities? Was white a symbol of purity or simply the most practical choice in summer heat? The answers remain stitched in uncertainty, leaving modern scholars with nothing but faded dyes and contested footnotes. You close your eyes, and the colors blur together, weaving into something softer. The sharpness of crimson fades to rose, the emerald melts into jade, the indigo deepens into velvet night. It becomes less about meaning and more about rhythm, a slow drifting tide of hues washing over you. And as you sink into that tide, you realize Ottoman fashion wasn't only about texture or structure. It was also about color's quiet power. Color as language, color as hierarchy, color as lullaby. You let the colors fade into a soft blur, and when your eyes refocus, you realize the story of Ottoman headwear is far from finished. Turbans may have dominated, but beyond them sprawled a whole menagerie of peculiar hats, caps, and hybrid contraptions that crowned the empire in sometimes dignified, sometimes bewildering styles. A grounded fact, while turbans were the most iconic, Ottoman men also wore fur-lined hoods in winter, feathered caps for ceremonies, and stiff felt hats in certain provinces. Janissaries, as you remember, had their tall Burke headgear, while officials sometimes balanced flat-topped caps that looked more like soft boxes than anything we'd call a hat today. Headgear was as diverse as the empire itself, signaling profession, rank and region. Now for the quirky flourish. Some ceremonial caps were decorated with actual bird feathers, most often heron plumes. In a stiff breeze, these delicate feathers quivered dramatically, so that rows of courtiers looked like fields of grass, swaying in unison. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate effect, meant to awe spectators, or simply an unavoidable hazard of outdoor ceremonies. Either way, the sight must have been both majestic and faintly comical, an empire of men reduced to bobbing ostrich impersonators. You watch in your imagination as a procession passes, tall white turbans at the center, but flanking them, courtiers in fur-lined winter hoods, their collars rising like cushions around their faces. Behind them, younger pages sport small caps perched jauntily to one side, while a visiting provincial governor insists on wearing his floppy felt cap, which droops so much it nearly covers his eyes. The whole effect is less like uniform dignity and more like a parade of experimental millinery. Here's the laugh to carry you along. Imagine a modern airport security line where every traveler must declare their hat as a badge of identity. Ah, yes, you're a lawyer, very fine turban, and you, sir, with the feather, regional governor, right this way. Fashion as passport control. The truth was that headgear mattered because the head was sacred. Covering it was a sign of respect and piety. But the Ottomans elevated that respect into theatrical display. The more extravagant the hat, the more clearly the message was sent. And yet practicality still peeked through. Those fur-lined hoods, they were genuinely warm, essential for winters when the Bosphorus froze along its edges. Historians still debate how far regional differences persisted. Did Anatolian farmers really wear the same floppy felt caps in the capital, or did they switch to more polished turbans to fit in? Some sources suggest a blending, with migrants adopting urban styles, but keeping touches of their provincial roots. You let the images of hats swirl, feathers trembling, furs softening, felt flopping. Slowly, the distinctions blur until they're just gentle shapes drifting across your inner vision, like clouds in a slow, sleepy sky. And as they fade, you feel yourself drifting too, lulled by the strange crown of Ottoman fashion, a kingdom of turbans, yes, but also of every odd cap and yew. Plume that could balance, however briefly, upon a weary head. You let the plumes and floppy caps flutter out of sight, and now the palace doors swing wide to reveal a grander stage. Outside, the city itself becomes a runway, and fashion marches not in quiet corridors, but in booming parades and public ceremonies. Istanbul on festival days was less a city than a living pageant. A grounded fact. The Ottomans staged elaborate public processions for religious holidays, military victories, and imperial weddings. These events could stretch for miles, with soldiers, guilds, and court officials parading in their finest. Clothing wasn't just attire, it was performance carefully choreographed to impress citizens and foreign dignitaries alike. Now the quirky detail: some parades included entire guilds demonstrating their trades on moving floats. Bakers kneaded dough, tailors stitched cloth, and jewelers hammered mock rings, all while rolling slowly through the streets. Historians still argue whether these were genuine demonstrations of skill or mostly theatrical displays, but the effect was dazzling and faintly absurd. Imagine a tailor trying to thread a needle while jostling down a cobblestone street in front of thousands. You settle into the scene. Horses prance in embroidered saddles, their manes braided with ribbons. Janissaries march in stiff formation, stovepipe hats bobbing. Courtiers glide past in shimmering robes, each hem catching the sunlight like rippling water. And high above, banners snap in the breeze, their colors echoing the fabrics below. It's less a parade than a moving tapestry. Here's your chuckle. For tonight, imagine your local parade featuring not floats with cartoon balloons, but accountants balancing ledgers on horseback and bakers tossing loaves into the crowd. The Ottomans turned civic pride into a fashion-forward carnival. Spectators lined the streets, craning their necks, whispering about the meanings of colors and the sparkle of jewels. To ordinary citizens, these processions were their rare chance to glimpse the fashions of the palace, robes they would never otherwise see, fabrics too precious to touch. For many, it was the equivalent of front-row seats at the empire's Grand Fashion Week. Fashion here wasn't frivolous. It reinforced hierarchy. The sultan appeared last, gleaming in robes so heavy with embroidery they required attendants to adjust them as he rode. Behind him trailed gifts, cloth, coins, sweets, tokens tossed to the crowds. Children scrambled for candies while their parents whispered reverently about the gleam of silk, the cut of sleeves, the brilliance of turbans. Historians still debate whether these processions were primarily political theater, religious devotion, or pure celebration. Likely they were all three. But no matter the intent, the memory of them lingered. European visitors wrote of being dazzled, local poets compared the processions to rivers of jewels, and the people of Istanbul went home with their heads full of colors and their clothes dusted with rose petals thrown from balconies. You drift deeper into the pageant. The horses, the banners, the shimmering robes all merge into a blur like fireflies weaving through dusk. And as the crowd's murmurs fade, you let the slow rhythm of the parade carry you. Each robe another step, each turban another drumbeat, until you're adrift in the lull of Ottoman ceremony. Fashion turned into spectacle, and spectacle turned into dream. The pageant fades, the cheers of the crowd dissolve into night, and you find yourself drifting into a quieter century. Time has shifted, and the fashions around you begin to look different. Still Ottoman, but touched now by winds from the west. The empire's robes are still heavy with history, yet their edges are fraying under new influences. A grounded fact. In the late Ottoman period, especially the 18th and 19th centuries, Western European fashions began to creep into Istanbul. Sultans and statesmen experimented with frock coats, trousers, and military uniforms modelled on French styles. The fez, once an imported hat from North Africa, was adopted in the early 19th century as a symbol of modern reform, replacing many older turban styles. Now for the peculiar detail. When the fez was first introduced, some conservatives resisted, grumbling that it was too plain compared to the grandeur of traditional turbans. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of the fez represented genuine modernization or a symbolic surrender to Western influence. Imagine men reluctantly trading their towering cotton castles for a squat red cylinder, muttering, "Well, it's easier to put on, but it doesn't block the sun as well." You watch a minister step into the divan chamber in a hybrid outfit. European-style trousers, Ottoman sash, and a frock coat tailored with gold embroidery. He looks half Parisian banker, half Istanbul pasha. Around him whispers ripple, some admiring the efficiency of the new cut, others missing the old sweep of silken robes. Here's your sleepy laugh. Picture an office where half the workers insist on wearing three-piece suits, while the other half refuse to give up bathrobes. That was late Ottoman fashion, caught between comfort, tradition, and imported modernity. Clothing now carried new political stakes. Reformers embraced European tailoring as a sign of progress, while conservatives clung to turbans and kaftans as symbols of continuity. Fashion became a battlefield, fought not with swords but with sleeves. Historians still debate whether Western styles truly replaced Ottoman dress, or whether the two coexisted in a patchwork. Portraits from the era show sultans in frock coats on one day and resplendent kaftans the next, as if unwilling to fully let go. You let the images drift. Turbans shrinking into fezzes, kaftans narrowing into coats, silks blending with wool. The empire is changing, and its fashion, once untouched, now bends with the tide. Yet even in decline, there is dignity. The echoes of earlier grandeur shimmer faintly, like embroidery worn smooth but never erased. And as you sink deeper, you realize fashion here tells not just of beauty but of history's weight, how an empire stitched itself into the world, and how slowly, stitch by stitch, those seams unraveled. You let the frock coats and fezzes blur, and now you drift forward into our own age, where Ottoman fashion has long since passed, but not disappeared. Echoes of kaftans, turbans, and jeweled slippers ripple across modern runways, film sets, and even your bedtime imagination, reminding you that nothing stitched with such care ever truly vanishes. A grounded fact. Ottoman-inspired clothing surfaces regularly in contemporary fashion. Designers borrow flowing silhouettes, rich embroidery, and jewel-toned palettes from museum collections. Even the kaftan has found new life in beachwear, party gowns, and bohemian wardrobes around the globe. Cinema and television, especially historical dramas, have resurrected turbans and embroidered coats, translating courtly grandeur for modern eyes. Now for the quirky flourish. Some fashion houses in the 20th century even experimented with modernized fezzes, though they never quite caught on outside costume parties. Historians still argue whether the fez today is best remembered as a symbol of modern Ottoman reform, or simply as a quirky souvenir hat tourists buy in Istanbul's bazaars. You imagine a modern runway show. Models glide in long robes reminiscent of Ottoman kaftans, except these shimmer under spotlights instead of torchlight. Their shoes curl just slightly at the toes, like a wink to the past. In the audience, designers nod solemnly, pretending they've invented something new, when in reality they're just replaying the empire's old tricks with fresher thread. Here's your chuckle tonight. Imagine a film extra, hired to play a janissary, trying to balance a stovepipe Burke hat while sipping a latte during a break. The image is ridiculous, but it proves something. Ottoman fashion remains vivid enough to be parodied, revived, and reimagined. And you notice, too, how it lingers in smaller ways. A patterned scarf, a robe-shaped dressing gown, a tassel on a graduation cap, all faint descendants of those mighty turbans, shimmering robes, and perfumed sleeves. The empire dissolved, but its stitches carried forward, thread by thread, into the modern fabric of daily life. Historians still debate how much of this influence is direct and how much is coincidence. Are today's kaftans truly Ottoman heirs, or just parallel inventions in a global swirl of fashion? The arguments matter less to you now, lulled by the simple idea that beauty echoes even across centuries. And so, the story slows. You walk once, more through the palace in your imagination. The turbans rise like clouds, the kaftans trail like rivers, the slippers squeak and clop, the perfumes linger in the air. Then slowly the palace fades, and you are left with only the gentle rustle of fabric, ancient, soothing, endless. Now the rhythm softens, and your breathing follows it. You are no longer walking through marble courtyards or dazzled by embroidered silks. You are lying still, the palace dissolving around you like mist. The robes you saw are only shadows now, drifting in the quiet. The colors fade into softer tones. Crimson dulls to rose, emerald melts into green-gray, indigo slips into the dark of night. The scents, once sharp with clove and musk, soften into something like fresh linen in a breeze. Even the laughter of children in their tiny turbans, the squeak of leather slippers, and the clop of wooden soles all recede until they are just faint echoes, steady and calming. You picture the Sultan's court, once so full of sound and spectacle, now silent under the stars. Robes folded away, turbans unwound, slippers set aside. The city of Istanbul itself quiets, its streets dark and still, only the Bosphorus whispering softly in the night air. And you, floating outside of time, carry with you not the weight of those garments but their softness, the lull of fabric, the slowness of stitches, the gentleness of colors sliding one into another. You realize that fashion, for all its pomp and ceremony, is just another way people once tried to feel beautiful, dignified and alive. Let your body feel heavy now, like a robe settling on your shoulders. Let your thoughts drift slowly, like sleeves swaying in a breeze. There is nothing to carry, nothing to decode, no laws of luxury to follow, only rest, gentle and steady, like cloth folding itself into stillness. The palace has gone quiet. You are safe. You are warm. You are asleep.